After the world had its first taste of nuclear weapons on August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, paranoia spread across the globe, rooted in the petrifying fear that such a monstrous weapon might be used again. Consequently, tensions began to mount between the countries with the greatest nuclear stockpiles in the world, the United States, together with its allies in NATO, that is, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union. These pressures culminated in the Cold War, a massive standoff between the powers of democracy and those of communism that lasted for over 40 years. While tensions ran high throughout the period, one event stood out, going down in history as possibly the closest we as a nation have ever come to full-blown nuclear war, an event now called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis began on October 15, 1962, when a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba brought back evidence that multiple ballistic missile sites were in various states of construction across Cuba. The revelation that the Cuban missiles had enough range to bombard any city inside of a massive part of the United States prompted a quick response. The day after the missiles were discovered, the president formed a group called ExComm, short for Executive Committee, with the sole purpose of ending the crisis. On October 22, 1962, after considering all their options and rejecting possible courses of action including simply acquiescing to the presence of the missiles, using pinpoint missile strikes to eliminate the sites in Cuba, and full-scale invasion, President Kennedy went on air in a televised speech informing the American people of ExComm's decision to surround Cuba with a quarantine or blockade.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The blockade began the day after the speech was given, but the quarantine line was pulled back 500 miles in order to give the Soviets more time to negotiate. For a time it seemed that Soviet ships en route to Cuba were changing course or slowing down at least, but on October 26th it was discovered that the construction on the missile sites was continuing without interruption. Just as ExComm was considering the possibility of the U.S. invading Cuba as a result of the continuing development on the missile bases, the Soviet Union sent a proposal offering to remove the bases if the United States pledged not to launch an invasion. However, the very next day, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev changed the offer, instead demanding that the U.S. remove their missile emplacements in Turkey. ExComm had only begun to consider a response when it was learned that a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba had been shot down, killing its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. Anderson was the only American casualty of the crisis. While much of the Pentagon staff was infuriated, President Kennedy would not allow any retaliatory action to be taken as long as another plane was not shot down. ExComm finally decided to agree to the Soviet Union's terms and get rid of their Jupiter missiles in Turkey. In exchange, the Soviet Union formally announced their intent to remove all Soviet missile sites from Cuba. In the following months, the blockade was ended, the missiles removed from both locations, and at last the crisis was over. The Cuban Missile Crisis was characterized, above all else, by tension, both in the severity of the situation itself and in negotiations to resolve it. While there were no good guys and bad guys in the conflict, it did arise partially due to Soviet dishonesty about the state and intention of missiles in Cuba, as President Kennedy addressed in his televised speech.
By the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction, constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. In flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warnings to the Soviets on September 4th and 13th. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character, and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation.
This atmosphere of hostility and distrust was reciprocated from the Soviet side, as shown by multiple references within the correspondence between Cuba's Prime Minister Fidel Castro and Soviet Premier Khrushchev to the Americans as the imperialists, and to the immense danger he believed they posed to all mankind. The tense and hostile mood that established itself during negotiations was important because it set the tone of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union for the remainder of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the nation's first encounter with the reality of being on the brink of full-scale nuclear war. It showed the world how devastating such a war would be, and why one must never be fought. During the course of negotiations, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy told Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin that if the U.S. were to bomb missile sites in Cuba, it would have brought about a real war that would have meant death for millions of Americans and millions of Russians. The fact that our nation came so close to having such a catastrophic event occur helped to instill humility and wariness in future United States policymakers. A strong example of how President Kennedy and his advisors in ExComm resolved such a volatile crisis peacefully inspired many other U.S. leaders to seek similarly nonviolent solutions to different problems. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a pivotal event, not only in the context of the Cold War but in American history as a whole. The tense relationship that was established between the United States and the Soviet Union through the exchange of negotiations came to define the view of the two countries toward each other for many years to come. The close encounter the U.S. had with the possibility of nuclear war helped make stopping one from ever occurring a top priority on the U.S. agenda. Finally, lessons learned from those involved in resolving the crisis are implemented by the United States leaders even today. The crisis went down in history as the sole time when the Cold War teetered on the edge of becoming hot.